Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, there are 2 points of view on this. One is that the establishment of this country are doing all they can to frustrate and stop the will of 17.4 million people by frustrating, delaying, or even trying to stop Brexit from happening. The other is they're just doing their jobs. Either way, this whole debate since June the 23rd, 2016, has generated some of the most extraordinary front pages in British newspapers that we've seen in my lifetime. You might remember one in the Daily Mail, Enemies of the People. And that was when the judges said, no, Parliament has to have a final say on whatever deal it may be. And the Telegraph ran with the Brexit mutineers. And this was about a group of a dozen backbench Tory MPs, doing their absolute best to frustrate the Brexit process. But those headlines were as nothing compared to the headline generated today by the Daily Mail, in the light of the fact that the House of Lords has on 14 occasions voted against the government's EU withdrawal bill, even suggesting that the date for Brexit should not be set in stone. And so today we get, in the Daily Mail, Brussels must be chortling as these traitors in ermine betray 17.4 million voters. It's time to pull the plug on the House of Lords. Traitors in ermine. Wow. I've said one or two things in my time about the establishment of the pro-EU and the pro-EU order, but they are really very, very strong words. And before I move on to ask you what you think about that, I want to be fair and say this. On my LBC Sunday show, just gone, I interviewed Lord William Wallace of Saltaire, who was a Liberal Democrat peer. He's one of the leaders of this movement to overturn, through amendments, elements of the government's EU withdrawal bill. He's on record as saying that leaving the European Union without a clear and detailed agreement on the future relationship would be a disaster for our economy, our foreign policy, and our relationship with Ireland. So I asked him last Sunday if the series of defeats the government EU withdrawal bill is having means the House of Lords has overstepped the mark.
No, we're the second chamber, not an ideal second chamber. I'm in favour of an elected House of Lords, but we have to work with what we've got. And it's our job to ask detailed questions of where the government's going and if it's got it right and if it knows the detail. And there's an awful lot of detail in the question of leaving the European Union. The referendum asked a very simple question, but the answer is extremely complicated, and that's what we're looking at.
But tradition has it that the House of Lords does not challenge the government on legislation upon which it was elected. And we have the Conservatives, albeit not with an outright majority, but by far the biggest party, in an alliance with the DUP. And in their election manifestos last June, they both promised that we would leave the customs union and leave the single market. And it seems to me that your votes rather go against those manifestos.
We're not challenging the legislation as such. We accept that we seem to be going to leave if the government can sort out how we're going to leave and what we're going to leave. But as I'm sure you recognise, Nigel, the government has so far failed to agree what sort of future relationship with the European Union it has. It has these two ideas for some sort of customs arrangement, and it paid £700,000 to McKinsey's to invent one of them. They're both unworkable. And we are entitled as the second chamber to say, do you know where you're going? Does what you propose work? And if it doesn't, think again. That's what we're doing.
Well, that was Lord Wallace defending the fact that the House of Lords has beaten the government on 14 separate occasions, but there was a clue in that when he said, we seem to be leaving the European Union in March of next year, which indicates to me he's doing all he can to stop it from happening. But hey, you've heard his point of view, so let me ask you the very simple question. Is today's front page of a Daily Mail, where it calls those lords that have voted this way traitors in ermine, Have they, in this, gone too far? And if you think no, actually, the truth of it is the Lords have completely overplayed their role. It's time we did pull the plug on the chamber. Then call me on 0345 6060 973, or perhaps you think, no, they're just doing their job and scrutinising the government, in which case text to 84850. Or maybe you're one of those who thinks there is a halfway house, a compromise, in which case tell me what it is by tweeting using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course watch us on Facebook and comment there too. And there are some people now calling for reform. In fact, former Tory leader Ian Duncan Smith has called for a complete and total overhaul of the Lords. Daniel Kaczynski, Tory MP, has called for root and branch reform. Folks, I'm not calling for reform. We had reform. Tony Blair brought in the reform. He told us the House of Lords would be fit for purpose in a modern 21st century Britain. And what he and Cameron did was stuff it with 600 of their mates. You know, former MPs, party apparatchiks, people whose names you've never heard of, whose contribution to public life, frankly, has been very limited. Oh, I nearly forgot. Party donors too. I think the House of Lords now represents in many ways the metropolitan political class, and I thought way before these defeats to the EU withdrawal bill, I thought way before that, this is no longer fit for purpose. We should abolish it. We should get rid of it. And even if the term traitors in ermine seems a bit strong, frankly, they are breaking every normal historical convention. The House of Lords' job is not to overturn the manifesto of the government of the day. By the way, the Labour Party actually also, in their manifesto, said we should leave the European Union and the single market and the customs union. So I do not think myself, the Daily Mail, are too far wide of the mark. What do you think? Lorraine in Chelmsford, I'm going to ask you that very question. Good evening.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. I think now's about the right time, to be made public the actual amounts of monies the House of Lords receives, and also some sitting in the House of Commons, receives in things like EU farm subsidies, EU pensions, vested interest, and also, I think, ties to George Soros. I know that the Duke of Wellington receives over £80,000 a year in sub.
Yeah, well, I don't want to do the individuals, but Lorraine, your general point that there are many in the House of Lords who own big tracts of land, which of course does bring EU subsidy, your fact that there are quite a lot of former commissioners, former MEPs in there on EU pensions, in particular commissioners who have conditional pensions, all of that is true. I mean, I think the very least, Lorraine, is that in the debate on this, people should, in the House of Lords, have declared an interest, a financial interest, and do you know what? Not one of them did.
Well, I think it's absolutely disgusting. I mean, it is vested interest. They put in their own pocket before they put in the sovereignty of this country. That's the bottom line. Nigel, while I'm on, I'm going to get this in. Petition 209433. Give the electorate a referendum on the abolition of the House of Lords.
Yep, no, I'm aware of it, Lorraine. I'm aware of it, and I'm aware, that petition aside, I think I detect and sense a growing frustration with the House of Lords, and I think they've broken the Salisbury Convention. And Lorraine, you are not alone in being very angry with them. Thank you for your call. John is a first-time caller from Sunbury in Surrey. Good evening, John.
Oh, hello, Nigel. Yes, I'm furious with these lords and baronesses. They're all on the EU gravy train, getting subsidies and pensions, etc. And take Lord Panic, for example. He's still working partly for the EU, and he's the QC that helped take the UK government to court with Gina Miller. It's, crazy.
Well, I mean, John, to try and be fair, members of the House of Lords are entitled to have an opinion. Of course they are. But I think the problem, John, here is, number one, non-declaration of financial interest. That's a real issue, I think. And frankly, number two, the House of Lords is there as a revising chamber. It's there to amend legislation, but it's not there to go against the manifesto of the governing party. And that's what they're doing, John.
Yeah. Another point, Nigel, as well, which I want to say throughout the referendum, you had people like Branson and the Ryanair boss, Michael O'Leary.
Yep.
One of the reasons some of us voted to leave the European Union, or one of the reasons, was the amount of money it cost us to be a member.
Uh-huh.
Yet throughout the referendum, Branson, O'Leary, not one of them said, all right, if that's an issue, we'll cough up more money, we'll contribute towards it. But one of them agreed to do that, Nigel, and how to stop this with the Lords, make these old coffin dodgers, the people in the House of Lords, pay for the 20.
Well, I tell you what, John, on the money, we've had a very lucky escape, because the EU contributions are going up from about 1% of the annual budget of members to 1.4%. We may have just saved ourselves £10 billion a year by leaving. John, I thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go to Wadebridge in Cornwall, speak to Thomas, a first-time caller to this show. Good evening, Thomas.
Oh, good evening, Mr. Farage, sir. I'd like just to make a point in principle about the House of Lords, if I may.
Do.
I've heard the general principle of the House of Lords is to scrutinise legislation that has been decided upon in the House of Commons.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the job of any scrutiniser to ensure the legislation is fit for purpose it is intended for.
Yes.
Scrutiny does not include inventing a repurpose for different intentions to what the House of Commons had.
And particularly if it's been in the government manifesto, Thomas. No, I agree with everything you've just said. Is it your view, Thomas, that the House of Lords have gone way too far, and that in many ways that justifies the words used on the front page of the Daily Mail today?
Yes, sir. They've overstepped.
They've overstepped the mark. No, Thomas, I agree with you. So far, all of you think the House of Lords have overstepped the mark. Some of you are absolutely furious. I'm keen to hear from those of you who think, no, actually, they're doing the country a favour. They're doing us a service. Please let us know. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, and it is now 7:15. Traitors in ermine, that's what the Daily Mail called members of the House of Lords who've been voting against the government's EU withdrawal bill. And I'm asking you, is that language too strong, or do these Lords deserve it for going against the manifesto pledges of the government of the day? But before I get back to that, Italy, some movement in Italy. You'll remember 2 months ago, a very dramatic election with the biggest party emerging as the Five Star Movement. That was the party founded by the former stand-up comedian Beppe Grillo, and the League, a very, very strong Eurosceptic party. They were the ones that came out really as the winners of that election. Five Star getting 32% of the vote. And I have to say, it's taken 2 months for anything to really happen. But today, it would appear that the Five Star and the League are on the verge of getting together to forming a coalition government. They will have just over 50% of the vote. Now, they've been given an ultimatum by the Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, saying, folks, you've got till Sunday to sort this out, or in reality, there'll be another general election. Let me say, I've worked with both of these parties in the European Parliament, both of these groups, and I've been president of those groups, and these people have served with me, and I really want to see this coalition forming. It will be a much more Eurosceptic government than we've seen from what, of course, is the third biggest member of the Eurozone. And very interestingly, 60% of the under-30s in Italy voted for these two outsider parties. And I would say to some of our members of the House of Lords who seem to think this European Union is this wonderful thing, just look at what's happening in Austria, Italy, Hungary, Germany. Actually, the European model, as it's currently constituted, frankly isn't going to survive. Never mind. Traitors in ermine. Steve in Islington. Has the Daily Mail gone over the top in using that phrase?
Nigel, does that traitors in ermine include Lord Rothermere, owner of the Daily Mail? Is he calling himself a traitor?
Well, I suppose that depends how he voted, Steve, doesn't it, really?
Well, has he a right to have an interest in this debate, seeing there's a conflict of interest?
I would suspect, Steve, that Lord Rothermere does not affect day-to-day editorial policy of the Daily Mail.
Okay, and what about back in 2012 when Nick Clegg put forward a motion to reform the House of Lords, and it was voted down by Parliament? And some of the names that voted it down: Jacob Rees-Mogg, David Davis, Steve Baker, Nadine Dorris, John Redwood, Bernard Jenkins, to name but a few. Many of them are Brexiteers, but yet they voted down for a change of reform for the House of Lords. How is the House of Lords of 2012 any different from the House of Lords of 2018?
Oh, no, Steve, it's very different. We're 6 years on, and that means we've got about another 150 of David Cameron's close personal friends who were appointed to the House of Lords. Cameron, interestingly, appointing more life peers every year than any other British Prime Minister. So you could argue, Steve, the nature of the House of Lords has changed. It's bigger than it was. It's even more, metropolitan London elitist than it was before. But, Steve, I take your point that maybe one or two of these Tory MPs look a bit hypocritical in your eyes, yeah?
Well, I would say so, but I wouldn't have thought that the remit of the House of Lords has changed in that time. The numbers may have swelled, but they still have the same remit then now as they did then.
I mean, Steve, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because, we all understand the job of the House of Lords is to revise legislation, to say to government, look, we've got some expertise here. We're not sure in practice this piece of law works. Please have another think. And 3 times that ping-pong ball can go back and forth. And ultimately, ever since 1911 and the major reform of the Lords, the government can, of course, if it wants, force the legislation through. But, Steve, the difference is this. The convention has been that whilst the Lords will look at bad law, the Lords does not go against the manifesto of the government of the day. And, Steve, isn't it fair to say that that's exactly what they're doing here?
Well, isn't it fair to say that the Lords are ensuring that democracy works properly by pushing forward a second referendum on the outcome of the negotiations? Wouldn't that be fair?
Well, it'd be fair to say, Steve, that these are the very Lords who gave away our democracy and had us governed from Brussels for the last 40 years.
Yeah, but aren't they pushing forward for that so that the people...
The very same people, Steve, the very same people who argued most strongly against there being a referendum are now the same people who want us to have a second one.
Well, wouldn't that be fair? I mean, even your own Jacob Rees-Mogg said back in 2012 that we should have a second referendum.
Wow. Well, Steve, it wasn't the best of 3. But let me ask you a question. Since the so-called Great Blair reform of the House of Lords, we now have 600 people who've been stuffed in there by Blair and by Cameron. Do you think, Steve, we should either reform the House of Lords, abolish the House of Lords, or is it fine and dandy as it is?
Well, at the time when Nick Clegg put forward that vote, I was for Nick Clegg to reform. And I still am. But we are where we are, and the Lords are operating under the terms that they currently have. So we go with them as they exist at the moment.
Well, sorry, Steve. I think the country doesn't want that anymore. I think the country wants something very different from its second chamber, in terms particularly of the makeup of the people that are there.
So you want revolution, then? You don't want...
Absolutely, I am a revolutionary, a pinstripe revolutionary. Steve, I've always been for breaking lots of eggs to make omelettes. Listen, thank you very much indeed. And agreeing very much with Steve, Ross on Facebook says, the Lords have protected us against tremendously bad Tory policies. Thank goodness for them. They have a sense of humanity. There we are. So there are some who think the Lords are doing the right thing. Whether you agree in policy terms of what they're doing, how can it be right to oppose the very clear manifesto of the government of the day? That is not their job, in my view. James is calling from Clapham, a first-time caller to the show. Good evening, James.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Welcome. So, are the Mail absolutely spot on or completely over the top?
Of course, they're spot on, Nigel. I've just been checking now. Out of the House of Lords, out of the 781. Yep. I just added it up. 501 of them would be voting against the government.
Yep.
So how can that be? How can that be fair? And also, the 1832 Reform Act, which abolished the worst abuses of electoral system, which the Lords are standing for. So what the Prime Minister needs to do is, as you were saying, Nigel, go and make 400 peers, go and make it quite clear to the peers, you're going to vote for your abolishment, because when it is, you're going to vote for your abolishment, we can push it through. It doesn't need to go to committee, actually, Nigel, by the way. The Prime Minister, on the say-so of the Queen, can make them, push them in. They have a say-so then. You know after 3 years you're basically going to lose your title, and then we can get rid of that absolute cabal, which is nothing more than a Remain bunch of anti-democratic losers that can come out with a comment like this, that the Prime Minister is using Brexit like Hitler tried to seize power.
Wasn't that extraordinary?
Disgrace.
Yeah.
Lord Roberts of Llandudno should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
Yeah. James, I have to say I'm with you. I equally am very, very angry about the way in which they behaved. But my anger to this is not new. I've been arguing this now for some years. It isn't just the Brexit vote that makes me feel this. I just think the House of Lords is not representative of this country in any way at all. It is not full of the expertise, James, that it used to have. It's basically political apparatchiks who've been stuffed into the Lords. The things are nonsense. James, would you try and reform it or simply abolish it as it is and have an elected chamber?
We need to have an elected chamber, Nigel. It has to be abolished, because when you're having idiots like I'm not going to name them, but you know what I'm on about. We have hereditary peers. We have 4 dukes that are in the House of Lords, and Brexit will affect, especially one of them being a massive landowner. We won't mention.
Well, yeah, and of course that particular one, who we can't mention, was also a former MEP and a Euro fanatic. James, thank you. Strong opinions there from Clapham. I'm going to Brighton, speaking to Ben, another first-time caller to the show. Good evening, Ben.
Good evening, Nigel. So I'm looking for some assistance here, please. I just need some clarity.
All right.
This House of Lords.
Yep.
It's populated by hereditary peers who have vast tracts of land and gain
92
subsidies from the EU, is it?
92 of the nearly 800 peers are hereditaries. So Blair got rid of hundreds of hereditaries, but they got replaced by appointees of Blair and Cameron's.
Oh, I see, because that's where I was getting confused, because I was thinking they can't all be hereditary and appointees.
No. A lot, Ben.
It's a confusing situation.
A lot, Ben, who've been appointed are very wealthy. Many are still landowners, not necessarily through their hereditary rights, but through the wealth that they have. But really, Ben, the issue isn't so much, and I know there's lots in the Daily Mail about individual peers, former European commissioners and all, and a lot of that makes me angry. But the issue here actually is not the individuals. The issue here is the House of Lords is a revising chamber. In your opinion, Ben, and time is short, but in your opinion, has it overstepped the mark by voting 14 times against the government's EU withdrawal bill?
For me, Nigel, it seems that its job is to revise legislation that is put towards it. Mm-hmm. So it has to send it back and say, guys, you need to think about this again. Surely that's its job.
Even if it was part of the governing party's manifesto?
Yeah, but we can't just commit, suicide nationally just because it was part of a manifesto. Surely we have to be intelligent enough.
So you think Brexit's suicide, do you?
We haven't done this right, have we?
So you think Brexit's suicide, Ben, do you?
No, don't get me going on that, but I suspect...
No, well, clearly you do. I mean, you are not giving me a partial opinion here, Ben. You think Brexit's a disaster, therefore you think it's justified for them to do anything to slow the government up.
No, I disagree with that. No, I think it's completely within the remit of the House of Lords to say, I actually passed this piece of legislation back to you because, in our opinion, whether we're hereditary or appointed, we don't think you fully thought through this piece of legislation, and we'll ask you to look at it again.
Well, and I've no doubt, Ben, what they really want to do is ask the 17.4 million people to vote again by pushing for a second referendum. Thank you for your call, Ben. Great to hear from you. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's now 7:31. Traitors in ermine. That is how the Daily Mail describe members of the House of Lords who've now voted 14 times against the government's flagship EU withdrawal bill legislation, something, of course, that was very clearly in their manifesto. Have the Daily Mail overstepped the mark using those words? That's the question I'm asking you tonight. Before I get to that, news has come out in the last couple of hours about the greatest summit of modern time. And that, of course, is going to be the meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. It's been announced this evening that it will take place in Singapore on June the 12th. Some had thought perhaps it would happen in a demilitarised zone between North and South Korea, but it is Singapore that's been chosen on that day. The President has tweeted, "We will both try to make it a very special moment for world peace." Well, we'll wish them both very well with that. Oh, little point worth mentioning, and I do hope some members of the House of Lords are listening to this. When back in the 1963 Singapore broke away from Malaysia, the main argument against it was they would be too small, that you needed to be part of a big country or a big bloc to negotiate your own trade deals, to be economically viable, and to have any presence at all in the world. But little Singapore said, the hell with that. We're going to be independent and do our own thing. And they're now hosting potentially the greatest summit of modern times. It all goes to show that actually independent... Oh, by the way, they've got more millionaires per head than any other country in the world. Oh, and I nearly forgot. They've got more trade deals that they've negotiated with other countries in the world than anybody else on earth. You see, sometimes there are those that will say, don't rock the boat. Don't risk the status quo. It's too dodgy. It's too risky. But Singapore proves that actually you can make it a very big success. And by the way, if you are a member of the House of Lords, do call 0345 6060 973. We heard from Lord Wallace of Saltaire earlier. And I had lunch today with a member of the House of Lords. I won't tell you his name, but he concluded lunch by saying, Nigel, I think it's time I and the rest of the House of Lords were abolished. So there are some, even within the House of Lords, who see the current behaviour as being frankly disgraceful and not fulfilling the function of that second revising chamber. David is waiting on the line, a first-time caller from Belfast. Hi, David.
Hello, Nigel. I just want to say is that we cannot scrap the House of Lords. I'll give you a reason why.
Go on.
Because they hold the government and the Prime Minister to account on behalf of the British public. If we didn't have the House of Lords, that means the British government can go ahead and do whatever it likes, which would penalise the British people.
David, I understand that point, and I agree with that point. When I say we should abolish the House of Lords, I'm not suggesting we don't have a second revising chamber. I'm suggesting we do have a second revising chamber, albeit an elected one, and we can debate what we call it. We may choose, David, to call it a Senate. We may get people, we may get them elected for one 15-year term. So I want the scrutiny to continue, but I just think the Blair reforms have made this place even more out of touch with the rest of the country than it was before.
Yep, I agree with that. As long as it's elected chamber would suit me, not voted in by these here Prime Ministers that fill the chamber up.
Yeah. Absolutely, David, and I'll be in Northern Ireland tomorrow. I shall be in Ballymena tomorrow, and I shall look forward to being in that very pleasant part of the world. David, thank you. Rattling on. Let's go to Kay, a first-time caller from Leon Solent in Hampshire. Good evening, Kay.
Good evening. I think they've done us a favour. We certainly need a revisionary chamber, and the current one certainly needs revising. And,
right.
And I would add to that, it's one of the revisions since life has moved on, conflicts of interests have moved on, the world has got a lot smaller because of all sorts of things. I think it's also time that maybe we thought about not having dual passport people revise our laws, because it so often isn't connected with investments overseas. I won't talk about the Cotonou Agreement and all that. And I object to the Remainers suggesting that I voted to leave out of pure ignorance. I happen to...
Well, Kay, you're a Leave voter and you're not stupid. Is that what you're saying?
I've spent lots of my life, huge proportion of it, being a foreigner myself.
Yep.
I've even had 3 years, nothing to do with the EU, but living in Brussels. I've also am interested enough when I make a decision to find out what's what. So you will have gathered I have read the Court of Auditors reports, many of them, and for example, the European Investment Bank, I suggest to anybody who
well, Kay,
is interested.
That level of detail, and by the way, I'm interested in our ongoing commitments to the EIB. But the point, Kay, is you've read it, you've thought about it, you're not stupid, you voted Brexit. Do you, Kay, do you feel the time has come to get rid of the House of Lords, that the Daily Mail are right in saying pull the plug? Would you prefer an elected second chamber to what we have now?
Well, we certainly need something, that's for sure. I've lived in Washington for 3 years, and the Congress and the Senate arrangement seems to work pretty well.
Yep, no, absolutely. Kay, I thank you very much indeed. Gina says on Facebook, these Lords seem very biased. Is there a balance 50-50, or are they mainly Remainers? Oh, Gina, they are mainly Blair, Cameroon, London-living, wealthy Remainers. Make no mistake about that. Leslie says, Article 50 is quite clear. Obviously, the Lords have trouble understanding it. Sack them! Brian says, the House of Lords is not trying to overturn the result, and to say so is utter nonsense. Really, Brian, what are they trying to do? When they vote for an amendment that says that the 29th of March, the day we're leaving the European Union itself, should not be set in stone, what on earth, Brian, do you think they're actually trying to do? Mark says they are not defending my national interests, nor, I think, the 17.4 million people and rising. David thinks there's no need to abolish the Lords, just need to remind them of what they're there to do. Use their expertise to enhance the government's legislation, not obstruct government policy. David, I agree with that, David, but with this mob, I'm afraid that's impossible, because they are beyond the pale. Alex is calling from Teesside, another first-time caller to this show. Good evening, Alex.
Good evening, Nigel. I thought I'd take the bait and give you a call.
You took the bait, very good. Okay. Well, Alex, you're on LBC, the floor is yours, I'm listening.
So first of all, do we actually know what an ermine is? I don't even know how to pronounce the word, but I've looked it up if you want to know.
Well, go on, explain to everybody. Go on. I think
apparently it's a sloat, especially when it's in its white winter coat.
Yes.
Whatever that means.
A stoat,
so brilliant
yes.
For the Daily Mail to speak to the people like that with a word that everyone understands. I think it's a lot of fuss over nothing. If you consider we don't actually know what the government's position on Brexit is yet, they're still deciding it in the cabinet. So,
oh, Alex, come on. The Prime Minister got elected saying Brexit means Brexit. I mean, it couldn't be clearer, could it?
She got elected with a reduced majority, with a lot of slogans that meant nothing. We don't really know what Brexit means. And even the cabinet don't, because they're falling out with it this week with Boris Johnson. So to pin this on the House of Lords, I think is unfair. You've got to remember that this legislation was going to go through without Parliament having a say-so. That's what the original intention was. And there's a lot of things that the government feel like they're not really being fair to democracy and giving the whole thing a say. Yes, Parliament and the Lords may have a balance towards Remain, but it's only bad legislation that will make them react. If it's decent legislation, they've got less of a leg to stand on to fight back against.
Well, whatever the deal is, Alex, whatever the deal is, the big picture is we voted to leave. We're very clear.
I agree, and that's fine.
You know, and so here's where my main criticism is of the House of Lords. We triggered Article 50, as the electorate were promised we would if we voted leave, albeit it took longer to do it than I would have liked, and we are leaving at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March next year, whatever arrangements we have on the customs union or the single market. And Alex, by the way, I agree with you, the government are useless. I mean, the thought that 23 months on the Prime Minister hasn't worked out our customs position, I agree. But Alex, any attempt by the House of Lords to frustrate that date is going against the will of 17.4 million people, in my view.
It may be, but if we're not ready to come out of that date, we shouldn't come out.
Well, I think, Alex, I know the problems, but rather like Donald Trump with Iran, I take the view no deal is better than a bad deal. Thank you, Alex, for taking the bait and giving me a call. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:45. I'm going to remember this front page for some time. Brussels must be chortling as these traitors in ermine betray 17.4 million voters. It's time to pull the plug on the House of Lords. And I'm asking you whether you agree with that or whether you think they've gone over the top. Tell you what, I agree. It's time to pull the plug on the House of Lords. I do. And I've thought that for a very long time. John is a first-time caller from Keighley in West Yorkshire. Good evening, John.
Good evening, Nigel. A massive pleasure.
Well, I'm very pleased to have you on the show. Thanks for calling. Now, tell me, have the Daily Mail gone over the top, or is it a fair criticism?
I think it's spot on.
Spot on, yeah?
Spot on.
So,
anyway,
but traitors, John, is a very strong word, isn't it?
Not when it's appropriate.
OK, all right. So what would you do to the House of Lords, John?
I think what you said, elected, get some unbiased people who are highly educated and decent and do the decent thing instead of trying to rob them.
Why do you think they're doing it, John?
It's all it's for the souls, Nigel. It's money.
Money.
Money, money, money. Nothing else but money.
Yeah.
Even the Christ child turned the tables over, didn't they?
Well, that's true.
And they call themselves Christians. They're not, are they? They're horrors.
Yeah.
All the lawyers. When you look at the money they're taking out of the country, the lawyers are taking God knows how many billion out of the health service. God knows how much the insurance companies. God knows how the legal system. I don't know. You'll know these facts.
But there is one problem, John. There is one problem, John. Yeah. Right? At the moment, we don't pay members of the House of Lords a salary. We pay them a turning up fee. So they turn up, they sign a register, they get about 300 quid, roughly, for turning up for the day.
Right.
If we move to an elected chamber, we will actually have to pay them salaries.
Nigel, if they're decent people, Christian, call it what you want, educated, knowledgeable, it'd be a pleasure to pay them.
All right.
When they're lined in their own pockets, it's absolute hilt. Because, it's all self-interest, nothing else.
I have to say, John, the powers of patronage that were used by Blair and Cameron, I mean, the whole thing is a complete disgrace and it needs to go. John, I thank you for the call. I'm going to go to Liverpool next to Aaron. What do you make of it, Aaron?
Oh, well, to be quite honest, Nigel, it's a pleasure to talk to you, of course, but it's just so frustrating that yet again they're trying to meddle.
Yes.
I do want to disagree with John just slightly.
Yep.
I don't think money is so much the big influence. I think they do generally, most of them, believe they think they know better than the majority of the people of this country. And that's so frightening. They're meant to be there to execute the will of the majority of the people of this country, and yet they just think they know better.
But we are the peasants, Aaron. We are the peasants, the ignorant. We need to be led by better people.
Clearly. But I do agree with you. We need to get rid of the chamber, but I think that the key thing is that we must take a step back and make sure that we don't go towards an American system where the second house has more power than it currently does.
Now you've raised a really important. You've raised a really important point here, Aaron. Much as I favour an elected second chamber, I see two big problems. One is money, because we will have to pay people full-time salaries to get them to do it, and the second is, if you have an elected second chamber, it is much more likely that it will feel that it's in the rightful place to challenge the primary powers of the lower house. So that is a big problem. And back in 1968, there was a major piece of legislation, Aaron, put before Parliament to reform the House of Lords, to bring an elected element in. And Enoch Powell and Michael Foot, I mean, people on different ends of the spectrum, got together to filibuster out that legislation because they feared that whatever their difficulties with the House of Lords, and of course in those days it was mostly hereditary, whatever their difficulties with the House of Lords, what they feared was an elected second chamber leading to, and you've put it beautifully, American-style effective paralysis. So that's what we face, Aaron. Either we stick with what we've got.
Yep, I think we can deal with both of those, though. I mean, when it comes to the money side of it, I think that the first thing we should do is to use a clause which says you get this considerable salary, but then you must also agree not to have any other job. No other interest. You must declare everything.
Well, declaring everything and having other sources of income are two different things. But all right, let's take the premise that we get the money straight. Yeah. And secondly, what else would you ask them to do?
I would possibly not even call it a chamber, but possibly a committee.
A grand committee?
Yeah, to invest in their minds that they're not there to actually be a government, but they're there to scrutinise legislation, and it's officially part of the constitutional remit.
Aaron, you've thought about the next stage of this, and I'm pleased that you have, because not many people have, and I thank you very much indeed for your call. Nigel, the House of Lords will be allowed to continue because they and the Commons are all part of the elite establishment, and we, the public, are too disorganised and feeble to abolish them. We need a Trump. Do you know what, Trump, despite the amazing things he's achieving, he's having big problems draining the swamp in Washington. So, taking on the establishment is never, ever an easy thing to do. Hi, Nigel. The Daily Mail are bang on right, mate. These lords seem to think they're gods. I'd do away with them, says Martin in Rotherhithe. Apparently, I get on Twitter, anyone with even the most reasonable questions of what Brexit is supposed to be is a traitor, despite the fact that even Brexiteers can't agree what it's supposed to be. The Daily Hate isn't interested in rational debate, says Tom. Well, Tom, the one criticism there that is right is that it's a complete farce that nearly 2 years on, the Prime Minister stands up at Prime Minister's questions yesterday and can't tell Jeremy Corbyn what her government's policy is on the customs union. A lot of this, actually, a lot of the failure of all of this is because of a total lack of leadership that is coming from the British Prime Minister and those around her. And she's emboldened, I think, many in the Lords and perhaps in the Commons, indeed in her own backbenches, by giving us this vacuum of policy and leadership. Let's go to John in Guildford. Good evening, John.
Hello. To a certain extent, I agree with the Mail, but the Lords know they can be overruled by the Commons.
Ultimately, yes.
Ultimately. So, to me, the real traitors are people like Anna Soubry, Nicky Morgan, Ken Clarke, and who was the previous Attorney General?
Dominic Grieve.
Dominic Grieve. They are the ones who will try to stop the Commons overturning these amendments. And they are the real traitors.
Actually, John, let me disagree with you.
Manifesto of the Conservative Party.
Let me disagree with you on one of those names. That Ken Clarke has been consistent on this since about 1961.
I agree, but he was still elected on this manifesto.
Well, I haven't seen what Ken Clarke's local election address in Nottingham was, and whether he did say something different.
Well, then if he didn't agree with the manifesto, he shouldn't have stood for Parliament.
All right, so you think party discipline should count?
Yeah. I'm a Leaver, and he's tried to overturn my view and put his view in place. He's saying he knows better than me.
Well, I make the case for Ken, John, because he actually would have been the Prime Minister of this country if he'd
he'd have taken us into the euro.
If he'd buried his real political ambitions, but he didn't, and he's stuck consistent. John, what? Okay, all right. Now I've just said a moment ago that I think one of the biggest problems here is a lack of leadership. John, put yourself in the position. You are leader of the Tory party. What would you do with Anna Soubry?
I would suspend her from the party.
What? Take away the whip, get rid of her, send a message to the others, get tough.
She's going against the manifesto.
Yeah.
Do you remember? I mean, okay, Ken Clarke, you say, but do you remember ABC? Anyone but Clarke.
Yes, I do. I do. John, the other thing is, isn't it time, though? All right, deal with those that you see as traitors on the backbenches. But, John, isn't it time Mrs May told us exactly what we're going to do with the customs union?
Yes, and she should say we're coming out of it, which is what she has said.
Yeah, OK. John, listen, I thank you very much indeed for your call. And John feeling very passionately there about those on the backbenches in the House of Commons who could ultimately be the biggest single problem, a bigger problem even than the House of Lords that Mrs may well face. Kenneth on Facebook says, the Mail, quite right this time, Nigel, 100%, no doubt. And Bella says, the Daily Mail is just as useless as May. Well, I don't know, Bella. You can call the Daily Mail lots of things. Useless, it most certainly is not. It is, a very, very important, powerful newspaper. It is using language that I I'm not sure I ever thought I'd see in this country, but these are the passions that are raised by Brexit and raised by the House of Lords, many of whom, frankly, want to stop it, want to delay it, in many cases want to make us vote again. I won't use the word traitors, but I will say they're a complete shower. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back now on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. At 10 tonight, it's Ian Payne. But now, it's going to be Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you very much.